for so many years, and to see it have grown and developed to the space where we're able to have this presentation today, to me it just shows the power and the blessing of Creator, but also the perseverance of these two phenomenal individuals that will be sharing. So with no further ado, creating a new national heritage area in Sowams, the homeland of the Massasoit. Presentation by Sachem Tracy Dancing Star of the Pokanoket Tribe of the Pokanoket Nation, and Dr. David Weed from the Sowams Heritage Area. Round of applause as we invite them to the stage.
Hello, everyone. I think I'm one of the shorter persons at the podium. Can we do it down a little bit? Okay. Well, hello. I am Pope from Wakanakis. I am Tracy Dancing Star. I am the Sachem of the Pokanoket Tribe, and I would like to thank Chief Two Hawks for welcoming us to present for you.
Thank you, and I'm Dave Weed, coordinator of this project that you're going to hear more about today. And I too am grateful for what Two Hawks has put together, not only this year but last year and in years to come. So I can't imagine a better conference to highlight some of the work that we've been doing.
So we are here to share with you how we are making our community, Sowams, into a place where not only people live, work, play, visit, but into a place where people take pride in it and find value in it. Now, space versus place. Space is a physical description of a place, but the connotation place really describes and emphasizes that attachment to that piece of land. So we want for people to have that emotional connection to Sowams. Now, where is Sowams? What is Sowams? Sowams is the ancestral homeland of the Pokanoket Tribe. It consists of what is known today of the towns of Bristol, Barrington, and Warren in Rhode Island, and also the city of East Providence in Rhode Island, and part of the city of Providence in Rhode Island. The towns of Seekonk, Swansea, Rehoboth, and Somerset in Massachusetts. So that is what's known as Sowams. And it wasn't all broken up like it is today with boundaries and towns. It was one big area that our people lived in and moved within. It became known as Sowams, not necessarily by our people, but the name kind of stuck. This was our land base. It was the home of the Pokanoket Tribe. Now, the Pokanoket Tribe was the headship of a greater confederacy of tribes and bands, each with their own land base, but all under the protection and given tribute to the Massasoit of the Pokanoket Tribe, who resided in Sowams. So this project is very important to us, to the Pokanoket Tribe, because it means recognizing and revitalizing lands and places and waterways that are very historically and culturally significant and sacred to our people.
What you just heard was what I never knew. I lived in Warren for 30 years, within sight of the Royal Pokanoket Burial Ground. That's now a park called Burrs Hill Park in Warren. Knowing nothing, I was curious when I discovered in March of 2017 that there was a ceremony being planned and a crypt being dug in the park. So I went over there and I started asking questions. What's going on here? Turns out that this was an effort to rebury the great Massasoit Usamequin. He's the man who met with the Pilgrims in March of 1621 and hammered out a non-aggression treaty with the Pilgrims, ensuring both the survival of the Pilgrims, but also of the Pokanoket tribe, who had been devastated the previous 3 years by a great plague that wiped out as much as 90% of their people along the Atlantic coast. I didn't know that. I wasn't told that in school. I began to learn the significance of the Massasoit and the fact that he was reburied in his homeland that he occupied, that was 40 miles away from Plymouth. If you go to Plymouth, I think people today mostly think that the Massasoit must have lived there. After all, there's a gallon statue of him there, and how else would he have met the Pilgrims if he didn't live there? Well, he walked there 42 miles, along with 60 of his warriors, to meet with the governor of Plymouth and to work out that agreement. What I also didn't know was that there were many more remnants of the tribe and of the colonists still existing in not just Warren, but each of these 9 communities that I was able to identify. And if you go on the SowamsHeritageArea.org website, you will find links to all of those places and more. And you will begin to understand the story of how Usamequin was unburied there in 1917 when Charles Carr, the local town librarian and amateur archaeologist, much like what Two Hawks was referring to earlier, was that as an archaeologist, he thought he had a right to unbury people in 42 grave sites there. That's what people did in 1917, and then sent those items to museums. And it wasn't until the passage of the Native American Gravesite Repatriation Act in 1990 that the tribes were able to petition those museums to return those gravesite items. And those were then reburied in a vault in a ceremony in March of 2017. You'll notice that the picture behind me, maybe you will notice, you can see, is of the tribal people that gathered there. But there's also another gathering next to it, and that's of the Pokanokets, who were not invited to that ceremony, even though that was their land. There's more if you want to know about that, but it's all over the internet. You can read the whole story. We thought it was important to correct that history and help people understand who the Pokanokets are today, not just were, but are today. And we put a marker there in the park that gives the whole history of that location and why that's important. You will also see a stone marker over the gravesite. That's what got me started in this, and it's from that that I began to learn what the value of placemaking is, that this was a unique and special and important place. It wasn't just a town park. There's a whole story connected with that. So we're excited to share that story.
So Dave found us and realized that we are not just a footnote in the pages of the history books. We are here. And we are a piece of history that's not talked about. The Pokanoket tribe, like many, has faced centuries of erasure from mainstream history. We are overlooked, and our voices are not heard. The victor writes the history and controls the narrative. So when Dave found us and asked us to share our story, we were like so excited, like someone wants to listen to us. And the more we shared, the more we talked with Dave, I think the more excited he became.
Absolutely.
And it became evident the historical significance of our story. And so you will see that what we are presenting today, this story, this very historical, significant story, is really the foundation for what we are doing.
So, how to tell the story? How do we get people to listen? How do we identify these special places? Well, it turns out, I didn't know until someone in Barrington, where the station lives, suggested, why don't we create a national heritage area? Some of you may be familiar with the Blackstone Heritage Area. It's one of the first in the country that tells the story of the Industrial Revolution. How about telling the story of the most amazing beginnings of our country right here in Sowams? So, National Heritage Areas, if you're not already familiar with them, are a program that started back in the 90s under the Reagan administration, actually into the late 80s. And it's a program that's set up for significant regions throughout the country to tell their story as designated by Congress. They're intended to encourage grassroots heritage stewardship, and today there are 64 of these throughout the country. Many of them in the Northeast. There are 5 of them that cross into Massachusetts, and many of them span multiple states. And we're looking at Sowams as spanning both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. They're both a place and a history. Doesn't that sound like placemaking? When a place tells the story, and that where the history really is written on the landscape. This is not about just making statements. This is about seeing places where historic events happen and where history unfolded over a period of time right down to the present. These are community-driven strategies. These are based on the investment of people in local communities who want to tell their own story. This is not the federal government coming in and saying, you've got to say this. This is our getting together and saying, this is our story. Will you approve this? And if so, continue to support us. So, heritage areas are not national parks, even though today the Blackstone Heritage Area is now partially a national park, got designated for Slater Mill, but there are 25 communities between Pawtucket and Worcester that contain that heritage area. We're not looking for a national park. We don't want the National Park Service to own or manage this or to control any of the land or property rights. Things remain as they are. This is just a designation. So within that, what heritage areas could do, obviously historic preservation, that's important, but not the whole story. We also want to present opportunities for stewardship, taking care of the land. That's very much on the agenda of the Pokanoket tribe. We want to provide opportunities for people for recreation. We want to obviously educate and interpret. We want to celebrate local traditions, cultures, and the arts. And we want to promote heritage tourism. That's the whole point of this effort, is to get people around, not only around the region and around the country, but around the world, curious and interested and visiting and learning. And that's what heritage areas are very good at. They tell stories that no one has heard. And in that, bringing people into an area, you promote economic development. That's kind of a spin-off on that.
Right. So you can see the possibilities and combinations of possibilities are endless. And there are many opportunities here. But what I want to tell you is a great place needs at least 10 reasons to go there. And when you're there, you need at least 10 things to do. That's called the 10-10 rule. So when people come, you just don't want them to come and say, oh, okay, I've seen it, and now let me go in my car and come home. You want to be able for them to see, let's say, the seat of the Massasoit, and know that there are other sites that they can go to that connect to this story, so they can go on a tour of the different sites in that area. Or they could hike while they're there. There's a beach nearby at Burrs Hill. They can visit the beach. So there are many different things to do for people when they come, to this area. And you're just, what you're really doing, it's a matter of just, offering a variety of things to do in one spot. You want just synergy to, take place.
Absolutely, and there's more than one story in each of these places. We start with historic stories, but we move through time to contemporary stories as well. So the process really is one that is both comprehensive and inclusive, and involves creating a feasibility study. That's the first step. We've already held community conversations in 4 different locations. We'll have more to come. But those conversations are to get input from people. This isn't just what a group of 15 people on the steering committee have decided. This is what an entire community needs to have input and really begin to take ownership of a new way of looking at things. And we want to demonstrate national significance. Even people who live in our area are not familiar with the importance of the stories that come from that region. So the National Park Service is going to look for nationally significant themes. We think the story of the Massasoit and his role in helping the English move in, and then unfortunately, after too many of the English moved in, 50 years later, we began to have difficulties that ended up in a rebellion against the English called the King Philip's War. And that's something we need to cover because it's something that other people are not aware of, including people who live in these towns. Those are stories that flow through the centuries, that are part of the living landscape of Sowams and tell the story of what happened on this landscape. So the themes will raise awareness and engage the public. We have 5 themes, so let me go through those. The first one is the time and place where 2 worlds met. This Sowams was really the nexus, if you think about it, of Western European cultures and then the cultures of the indigenous people who had been living here long before people populated Europe. And that's an important difference in helping people understand how those 2 things are connected. This non-aggression agreement was unique in American history. It was essentially the first treaty between the occupying English people and the indigenous people. and really provided a template, a blueprint, if you will, for how to go forward. And for 50 years, things looked like they might work. But you also recall that in 1630, outside of the Plymouth settlement, 1,000 people arrived in one summer, bringing enormous numbers of people to the Massachusetts, Boston, greater Boston area. And that population began to shift not only the balance of power, but the cultural changes in the indigenous population. They began losing their hunting grounds, not being able to travel as they once did, and unfortunately disease again broke out, a huge smallpox outbreak in 1632. That when you imagine losing 90% of your population during the plagues and then continuing to lose more people, you see this tremendous cultural change within the indigenous people of the area. So these divergent concepts of law, land ownership, and personal freedom were worlds apart and would change the course of history there.
And a lot of that history, again, the signing of the 1621 peace treaty, a lot of those details, a lot of the meetings were held in Warren, Rhode Island, which is part of Sowams. So again, a lot of people do not know the history and the significance of all of these interactions that took place, and they did not all take place up in Plymouth. A lot of those interactions took place right here in Sowams. And so, again, that's a very significant story that people in the area need to be aware of, and that people, when they come into the area, the story that they can learn.
So the King Philip's War, as I just mentioned, really was a complete change in the cultural domination of the area. This went from an area that was part and parcel of a people for thousands of years, suddenly, within the course of one lifetime, changing and changed really forever, in that sense, people's control of that area. Encroachment on the land, confiscation of tribal lands through treaties and other less than legal efforts, and then ultimately, following the war, enslavement of people from the tribes. These are people who were used to living their entire lives without external forces controlling them, and suddenly they're no longer able to live on the land and move freely. And that change then was replicated across the country. This was the place where that template began. It's an important story that needs to be told on a national level. Another story that takes place on the land, and it's part and parcel of that, is the friendship between Usamequin and Roger Williams. Here we are in Providence, and you will go to the State House and you will hear the story, but what you don't hear about is the connection between Usamequin, who got to know Williams when he first came to America in 1631, because he was in Plymouth at the time, and that was Usamequin's land, and he knew precisely what was going on there. They got to know each other, and Roger, being a good linguist, learned the Algonquin language and developed a friendship with Usamequin. So when he got into trouble a couple of years later, got shipped up to Salem, and then got in trouble again because he didn't think that the church and the state should be the same thing, that people should be free to believe what they wanted without some external control. The folks running the Mass Bay said, "You've got to leave." They sent troops in January of 1636 to make him leave. He got word of it, left, in the middle of one of the worst winters of the time, walked over 60 miles, and where did he go? To Usamequin's home. Okay,
He was sick.
and he was very sick.
Yes, he was very sick, and when he came to what is known as the area of Swansea, we took him in, and we nursed him back to health. He stayed with us for some time, and had we not nursed him back to health, he would have never made his way on his journey.
We wouldn't be in Providence. So, this was not only a place of religious freedom that Williams started. There were others who came to the area, in particular Baptists and Quakers, who also found freedom here to worship as they wished. And those stories are part of the stories we tell on this landscape. And by helping people understand how important Sowams was to the establishment of religious freedom in America, people can understand why this place is so special. I mentioned earlier enslavement and slave trading. Enslavement started long before people realized. We know that people were enslaved from Africa and brought to Virginia in 1619. But people were being enslaved here after the Pequot War in 1636. And then again after King Philip's War. And the people who were enslaved were primarily Poconokeets in this area, and as well as other tribes. But the enslavement process meant that people were not kept here to do slave labor. They were shipped to places like Barbados and other places in the Atlantic because once there, they would not know how to escape and return home. So while women and children were often served as indentured servants in English households here, for the most part, the male warriors, particularly those involved in King Philip's War, were removed from the area. And we even know a little bit about some of those at Barbados, who were returned, who eventually made their way back, and some of your relatives.
Made their way back.
Right.
Yes.
So there's a whole layer of stories about enslavement that needs to be told. And in addition, since Bristol and Warren and Providence are part of the Sowams area, we need to tell the story of enslavement of all peoples who occurred in those towns in particular. And then finally, this interplay of land and water. Poconoket people came here thousands of years ago for a reason. Yeah, well, people, yes, you've been here from the beginning, but this is a place where you could live easily because of the natural resources here. Land and water. You have fertile land for growing crops. You have water for transportation. You also for food. And in many ways, Sowams was, I like to think of it as kind of the capital of indigenous New England. This was the favored place for people to live. And that tradition of the rich land and water resources here carried over the next 350 years after King Philip's War to the establishment of mills along the streams and places like Slater Mill, but smaller in many of the local communities. And then also shipbuilding. Part of that, unfortunately, was to build ships for enslavement, but it also became an industry in itself that continues to this day. And today, Blount Boats in Warren is building the boats that are taking care of the offshore wind farms off of New Bedford. So we are part of that shipbuilding tradition today. We also have a lot of composite industries that have been built up around the sailing industry there. We have the Herreshoff Museum and other places that celebrate the history of the interface between land and water in this area.
Yeah. So, as you see, themes are very important, and we're using those themes, and that is how we're able to bring other cultural communities into our heritage area and, you know, add to our story. They're able to express their point of view, and they add to the narrative. You need equity. You know, equity in cultural narratives means including voices that have been historically silenced or marginalized, and it adds depth and diversity to our collective understanding of history. So everyone's narrative is important. The story of Sowams, yes, it starts with the Pokanoket, but then many layers just keep being added on to it. And you can see how the stories, you know, just start connecting and feeding into each other.
So Sowams becomes a very unique place, something that not only do the people who live there don't know about, but the rest of not only the country, but the rest of the world doesn't know about. And we want to tell that story. So we've been in the process of going through the first step, which is creating a feasibility study. And for that, we drew together a steering committee representing those 9 communities and others. And the Pokanoket, both the Sachem and the Sagamore are pictured here. There she is, and there he is. This is part of our effort to tell a representative story from the based on what the people who live there know. This is an important aspect of National Heritage Years. They come from the place, not outside. So we managed to get a National Preservation Grant that got us started, and we were able to hire the Point Heritage HDC consultants, a national consulting group who have done more than any other group to help develop heritage areas. They're working with several others right now, including us, but really helping guide us in this process. It's not an easy process, and we are closing in on a draft, our first draft of a feasibility study. Once that's completed, we'll have an opportunity for people to give us further input. And then at some point, we have to take this feasibility study to the National Park Service for them to review it, and then ultimately to make sure that we've covered all our bases on that. For that, we've had these community conversations. This is one that we did in Bristol, one of 4. So we were able to get input from people who live there, who may or may not have known any of this history, to respond and to give us new ideas about how best to tell this story. And then our final step in this process of the feasibility study is to go to Congress. It's Congress, after all, who decides who's going to be funded as a heritage area. So in that process, we have to convince them that this is not only a nationally significant story, but it's something that is worthwhile doing and worth funding. Once they agree to that and pass congressional legislation, we would be funded. It's not a huge amount, about $500,000 a year for about 15 years. Just, that would start the project. But of that $500,000, we have to raise another $500,000 locally. Okay, so this ensures that this is not a federally dictated program. This is something that comes from the community. They're there to help, but we need to do the work.
So, you know, being part of this process, I just have a few takeaways that I would like to leave you with. And the first one is that community is key. Dave talked a little bit about our community meetings that we have had. And in these meetings, the community, they provide such valuable insight and perspectives and feedback to what we are presenting. But, you know, the community, they can also help identify issues and resources that are really important, things that we didn't think about in that way. They have a lot of ideas, they have a lot of talent, and I really believe they're the most valuable resource and can be your best advocates when you're trying to do something like this. The other thing is you can't do it alone. You really need good partners who, you know, are really, you know, bought into this. You need partners who can contribute not just innovative ideas, but you need financial support, you need political support, you need people who are movers and shakers and just truly committed, you know, to the cause. So that's really important. Ignore the naysayers. There are a lot of naysayers out there. You just have to keep pushing and start with just simple, doable objectives. You have to build your support, surround yourself with people who share your vision. I think those are my takeaways. Do you have any takeaways from being involved in this project?
Well, be prepared for a long haul. Okay. What I started 7 years ago will probably be another 7 years before we get to where we want to be. And in fact, this goes on and on. The idea of starting a heritage area is so that you can continue to be a heritage area for the next generations.
Yes. Yeah.
And in addition, we're working with the schools. The tribal historian is teaching the social studies teachers in the Bristol Warren schools about the history of the Poconokeets so that the teachers can teach the right story to the children in our schools. We're also working to educate the public. I'm always happy to talk with any group that wants to invite us and explain more about this project. And in time, we'll be inviting you to participate and support what we're doing. And I very much appreciate what Two Hawks is doing here in terms of gathering this larger community, not just locally, but worldwide, to talk about what is special about this place.
So I would like to thank all of you for being a great audience and listening to us, share how we are using cultural placemaking to reflect the culture and history of the Pokanoket tribe and create a place where all people can learn about and appreciate the rich heritage of this land and what it has to offer. So I think at this point we will field some questions if anyone in the audience has any, but I'm going to leave that for Dave to do because I do have another engagement that I do have to be at, and I'm going to need to leave. So thank you, and Dave will field questions.
Round of applause.
I'm curious, let me ask a question. How many people here have heard of at least one heritage area somewhere in the country? One person? They've been working on one in Montana. Anybody else heard of a heritage area? Someone in the back there, yes.
I was curious, how long did it take you to get the political buy-in to be able to place historians into the school district and convince the community leaders that that was something that they needed to happen? Because normally you get a lot of resistance in the curriculum because it's mandated by the state. So I was just curious about your crowbar approach.
Right. That is often a barrier. We're very fortunate, though, because the Rhode Island Department of Education, known as RIDE, just revised their curriculum requirements, and they're now, in the next 2 years, requiring every school system to rewrite their social studies curriculum. So it couldn't have timed better, because that's exactly what we're doing, is rewriting the social studies curriculum. And the state is asking for that to be done. So we don't see that as a barrier here. It may be in other places. Any other thoughts about heritage areas? How many would like to start a heritage area where you are? Before you do that, talk to me. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm curious about the communication strategies that you would be approaching this with, that you found to be effective to garner diverse support from like all of the bullet points you have up there.
Well, that's a challenge. This is, any of you, I know many of you are involved in community organizing, and I think, Brian, you're going to talk about that a little later as well. That the whole point of bringing people together is to get buy-in and participation and ownership, that people on the ground need to understand that this is their project. The benefits are going to be theirs, and they are in charge. That's not easy to get across, and when it's like a lot of, if you will, federal programs, you know, people are skeptical at the beginning, and then once it gets going after 10 years, people turn around and say, well, why didn't you ask me in the beginning? Well, we did. Not everybody's ready to join what you're doing right at the start. And it's not an easy concept to get across to people about what a heritage area is. So it takes a lot of work, and like I say, we spent 7 years on it so far. I certainly would imagine at least another 7 years before we get to the place where people really feel comfortable and know what we have in the way of a resource. Any other questions?
Yes, well, I had a question, and I was really trying to deal with the fact that heritage and nationality plays an important part. They really go together. And how do you approach getting the awareness to the people to approach that they are the people of to be nationalized? And even having the national, as you said, you're in the school system. How do you get the school system to approach an educational program that will allow you to even nationalize the people?
Well, that's a good question, an important question. And I think, Silas, you're going to address some of that tomorrow. But there are, I think what we're trying to do is to demonstrate that you need to pay attention to the first people who are here, so that you can understand the arrival of every other group, okay? Not just the English, the French, the Spanish, and then more locally and more recently in the last century, the Portuguese, Cape Verdean, and other groups, so that people begin to understand the layering. That's why I was asking the question about, you have one place, but you have many stories. But you've got to start somewhere. And we think a heritage area is a good place to make that start. We will invite every group to tell their own story.
Dave, I have a question,
Yep.
sir. What is the biggest surprise that you bumped into going through this process? Something that may have hit you and you'd be like, I had no idea that would even be something that we needed to deal with.
Well, for me, I didn't come from a history background. I was a psychologist for 40 years and then retired, and then this has taken over my life. But I think ultimately the biggest surprise for me was just how rich this area is. You live in a place and you know a few things, but it's not until you really get out there and start looking and talking to other people, you begin to understand the complexity and all that's going on and all the resources in the area. And until you investigate, you don't have any way of knowing that. Nobody makes it easy to find all these other stories. And that's, for me, that's the richness of being involved in this, getting to know all kinds of things I had no awareness of.
Any other questions?
Anybody else?
So I think you've shared some of this already, at least through the way in which you outlined the 5 themes. It tells us a little bit about how do you go about telling that story. So I guess rather than thinking about it in the broad thematic sense, I mean it almost in the nuts and bolts practical sense. What does it look like to tell that story? Like, how do you actually do that on the ground in these locations? Like, you get that 500 grand, right? And you're able to match it. What does that start to look like for us in these places?
A lot of that 500 grand, if you talk to anybody in any other heritage area that's been in existence, that gets farmed out to the local organizations. It becomes the starter money on new projects. A good example is in the Blackstone Valley Heritage Area. They started a theater group there, okay, using heritage area funds. They started the Museum of Work and Culture, came about after that. These are things that stimulate. The money isn't intended to just buy a particular location. It's there as a resource that people can then amplify to do other things. And remember, we're talking the whole range of cultural events. It's not just history that you're there to stimulate. So that's what's. I think heritage areas are a brilliant program. They've already they've done a number of studies across the country and proven that they are economic drivers in each of those areas, to the tune of millions of dollars in these places. And they're telling stories that no one's ever heard. One of our consultants runs the Rivers of Steel heritage area in Pittsburgh. What's the story they talk about? The steel industry. And not just from a historic point of view, but also from a dynamic point of view in terms of the stories of the workers, the stories of management there, and the stories of community development that took place over that time. If you're ever in Pittsburgh, stop and take a tour with them. You will learn more than you ever realized was going on there. And that's the beauty of these things. They explode with information and new knowledge. I'm one of those people who went through life thinking, well, I had a high school history course, and yeah, I did take 1 quarter on world history, so I know all I need to know. Well, when you discover these heritage areas, you suddenly learn all kinds of things you had no idea that were taking place in that area. It becomes a rich resource for folks.
Anyone else?
Anybody else? So, if you're in this area, help us promote the heritage areas. Thank you for listening.
Dave, thank you very much.